Taash is a narcissist. Taash is dumb and the worst companion ever. Taash is woke propaganda. These are just a handful of comments that I have seen from both the far-right conservatives and the LGBT community that have criticized Taash and their identity. The Dragon Age fandom, like all other fandoms, has its discourse and its problems, but for some reason, Taash seems to make up quite a bit of that discourse. And personally, I'm so tired of seeing it. As a non-binary person, seeing someone want to fix Taash or fix Taash's story or their coming out is very saddening and quite frustrating to see. You're really telling me that this well-meaning, traumatized, and constantly othered character deserves all the hate they've been getting? Taash goes through an identity crisis, their mother rejecting them, trying to accept both parts of their culture, learning that some weirdo is hunting them down, and then their mother dying. Not to mention, if you don't romance Harding or Taash, and then have Harding be sacrificed at the end of the game, Taash loses their partner. It's safe to say I love this character, and I'm going to try to show you why, while also addressing all the complaints you guys seem to have. Hopefully that turns some of y'all around, but Veilguard is not meant for everyone, and perhaps Taash just isn't meant for everyone as well. And those of you who are inevitably going to leave mean comments, just remember, you're giving me a boost in the algorithm, so thank you. Somehow there are far-right people and bigoted people in general playing Dragon Age games, which is strange because since 2009 there's been quite a number of LGBTQ plus characters and marginalized characters, but again, it was 2009, so I guess I shouldn't be shocked. Most of the outcry about Taash has been centered around their non-binary identity, which fits under the transgender umbrella. And a lot of that outcry has primarily been the fact that you can only be 1, supportive of Taash, and 2, cannot misgender Taash at any time, and if you do, you're seen as an asshole. Any normal person would see why it's probably a good thing that being supportive of Taash is the best option for everyone, and it also wouldn't really be great if they inserted transphobia into an inclusive game that was made in part by a trans woman and written by a non-binary person. As a non-binary person, I was very happy to see a main companion actually be trans and also be part of a underrepresented demographic as well. I can count on one hand how many trans people there are in the entirety of the Dragon Age franchise, at least the named trans people. 1, a drag queen from Dragon Age 2 that I think is called Serendipity. 2, Cremisius Aclassi, who is from Dragon Age Inquisition, and he is a binary trans man. 3, Mayveris Talani, who is a binary trans woman, and she has been all throughout the comics, and she also makes quite an appearance in Dragon Age the Veilguard. And 4, Taash, and a couple other NPCs who are also non-binary. Outside of these characters, there's little to no representation of any trans people within the series, but there is plenty of rep of other orientations and identities. From day one, Liliana and Zevran were bisexual. Every single romance interest in DA2 was bisexual, aside from Sebastian Vale. Sarah is a lesbian, Dorian is a gay man, and Iron Bull, Josephine, and Harding are all bisexual options. It's about time we had some trans representation as well. And I think every single person on the binary side of the trans community needs to cool their jets when it comes to criticizing Taash, especially criticizing Taash's identity and their story. I've seen people try to rewrite Taash's coming out scene, and regardless of identity, since these people may be trans, I have no idea, it is disrespectful towards the non-binary writer of Taash's story to rewrite that scene. I'll talk a little bit later about Trick Weeks, the writer of Taash, in depth. However, the sole reason I bring this up is because everyone who is criticizing Taash online is saying how their identity and the way it comes across is clunky. If you're trans yourself, you know just as well as I do that being trans is terrifying, for lack of a better word, and it can be made even worse when you come out to your parents. Lots of people, myself included, have experiences where coming out to their parents and their family has been awful. And to a degree, Taash also has this experience because Chthon does not quite understand their identity at all. While Chthon is in fact supportive, she doesn't understand and tries to police or correct Taash on how they feel, with good intentions, of course. But that does not negate the fact that Taash clearly feels frustrated that their mother, their only family, attempts to correct them when they are being incredibly vulnerable, and has had very little instances in which they felt like they could be vulnerable with her. Taash has been built up to be this strong bulwark against the Autism and all other outside forces that would want to exploit their abilities. They've had to live in a state of survival for so long. Now they know who they are, and you can clearly see that Taash just wants to get this over with, and they are sticking to exactly the word and identity that Mayveris's friends told them about, because this is how they feel. It just clicked when somebody explained gender that way to them. Perhaps there wasn't a right word for them in the Kuhn language, despite the fact there is the Akun Athok that Chthon talks about. To me, it seems that word specifically means those who identify with the other binary gender, and that does seem to be what Tash's mother insinuated here. Perhaps you mean that you are someone who feels they do not identify as the gender they were given at birth. Is accurate, and at the same time, it isn't. Taash has said time and time again they are neither man nor woman, and that they prefer they-them pronouns. While Chthon was trying to understand with this statement, she also relates her child's identity to something that still isn't quite right. We don't have exactly solid evidence that Akun Athok doesn't also include non-binary identities within its umbrella, and we also don't have solid proof that Chthon was actually trying to correct her child's identity because she's dead. But to me, I interpreted Taash feeling at least purely frustrated and probably angry that their mother was once again trying to tie them down with something they don't feel applies to them. It's messy. It's meant to be clunky and imperfect, and not even just for the things that are implied here. Coming out itself isn't perfect, no matter how understanding your parents might be or those around you might be. And cis people don't need this perfect view of us when we are coming out or trying to tell our identity stories. We are human. We're going to react differently from person to person. So why have some of you decided that Tash's story needs to be retold or remade? You hate supposedly YA scenes of trans people coming out to their parents and them being incredibly perfect or really, really mean. And you especially hate it when it's supposedly a big deal, especially when it's not written by a trans person. But this time around, it is written by a trans person. Trick Weeks is non-binary. They wrote Taash with actual lived experience and somehow have gotten so much flack. Much more than many cis people who write trans people have, for writing apparently clunky scenes. Why are we telling people how they should write the coming out and coming to terms with their identity stories of other trans people? Taash wasn't written inherently evil. They weren't written stereotypically or flat. You just like easily digestible stories. And I gotta tell you, being trans, especially being non-binary, is not easily digestible. We don't need to make our stories comfortable for people, and when it is uncomfortable, it does not mean that it is bad representation. It means it's real. Veilguard is about a lot of things, and one of them is that all of these characters are coming to terms with who they want to be. They are finding their identities as the game continues. It's just a little more obvious when it comes to Taash, and that's okay. It's perfect even. Taash was not written for you, the probably cisgendered heterosexual gamer. They were written for the transgender teenager that sobbed for hours in their room thinking they were rotten and wrong for being who they are. Now I'll give you a break from all that sad stuff and move on to this supposedly bad use of modern language when it comes to Taash and their non-binary identity. Apparently, the trans community has decided that using the word non-binary in a fantasy setting takes them out of the immersion. Akun Athok is defined as such: one who is born as one gender but lives like another. There are only 2 times that this term is used in the entirety of the series, other than when Chthon is explaining it to Taash. One is used in the explanation of the Autism, where a female perceived Kunari can join the Autism if they want, but will be under the term Akun Athok and treated as male specifically, as only male Kunari can be warriors. And the other time this term is mentioned is when you talk to the Iron Bull and Krem, where Bull says that Krem would be considered Akun Athok, someone whose gender does not align with what they were given at birth, and that people like Krem are not treated as any different under the Kun, with an emphasis emphasis on the pronoun he. Now, this doesn't shed any light on if they use the term for trans women under the Qun. They could have a different term for it, as it seems that a Qun athwok is a binary term for male people, which then negates it being used for Taash, who is non-binary, so therefore outside of the binary. Which begs the question, what other word would you have wanted them to use for Taash? Speaking in terms of strict Dragon Age lore, being a rules lawyer here, I don't think the writers would have thought the Qun would have made a word for non-binary people, seeing as they really like to put their people within boxes when they're under the Qun, which is an interesting idea in a bad way and really says something about the writing in a different light for Taash. More on that later. We'll get back to the point though. They could have made up a word for them, but I don't think anybody would be less critical of Taash's identity. And you want to know why? Krem and Taash were written by the same person, Trick Weeks. As far as I know, nobody has anything to say about how Krem identifies or about how Krem came out to the Inquisitor, unless of course they're talking about the fact that Krem was voiced by Jennifer Hale, a voice actress who does not identify on the trans spectrum at all, much less as a trans man. And also the fact that Krem can be misgendered in a way by the Inquisitor, which also isn't a good thing. But those are really the only 2 times that anybody has said anything ever about Krem being a trans man in a discourse sense. So do we only like well-established characters that are trans but don't show their struggle with being trans? And do we only like them when they're on the binary spectrum as well? Nobody had issues with Mayveris Talani either, although I don't know if Trick wrote them as well. It says a lot that the only trans person we dislike here is Taash. To me, that means you don't hate their character because of the use of modern language or supposedly clunky writing. You don't like being faced with someone who outwardly reminds you of yourself when you're coming to terms with your own identity, or you just don't understand being non-binary and you probably think it's a big ol' hoax. Feel free to yell at me in the comments though if I'm wrong or you think that I'm wrong. It at least gives me a boost in the algorithm like I said earlier. Another of the larger reasons why I wanted to talk about Taash in a video like this is because I keep getting comments about how Taash is being narcissistic or that Taash is childlike, etc, etc, etc. And what's funny is that I'm getting all of these comments underneath a video all about the Veilguard romances. It has nothing to do with Taash and their gender identity. And I gotta tell you, you guys are mean. So mean that I've had to actively comb through my comments at certain points and delete threads upon threads of stuff that people have been saying. One of them was to the effect that they wouldn't respect Taash and their identity if they were a worse person because Taash is narcissistic and mean to Emmrich that one time. You mean this scene?
Of course I do. We're colleagues on this journey.
Okay. Sorry I called you a liker. Skull liker.
That's child's play. You should see the shit that they say on Reddit. Anyhow, the narcissism is something that comes up alongside Taash's identity and criticism, or if not narcissism, that Taash is cringe or stupid or toxic. And I gotta tell ya, this fandom still has a massive problem with ableism, because Taash is very clearly autism coded. Not just that, there's evidence that they have been parentified as a child, have experienced pretty severe trauma, been infantilized, at least by the fandom, and have routinely not been believed or been told that they're wrong when it comes to their own identity. On top of belonging to the Raveni culture socially and ethnically, they are Qunari diaspora, which has its own trauma on top of it all. That's a lot for anyone to process, I know, so we're gonna start with the first point, the autism. Taash loves talking about dragons. It's part of their culture as a Qunari. They're an Adari, which means they're a fire breather and have similarities to dragons. An holistic person, someone who doesn't have autism, would probably talk about dragons a lot, but wouldn't have any problem with switching up a conversation when they realize someone doesn't like dragons, right? Let's go back to that scene with Emmrich.
Emmrich, you clearly find talking about dragons boring.
What? How? Who doesn't like dragons?
Aren't you curious why Taash likes them as much as you like necromancy?
So Taash thinks everyone is into dragons, regardless of how their cultures might see them, or perhaps even if they are afraid of dragons. Might just be a cultural difference. But let's just put a counter up here that says autistic traits and keep an eye on it for now. Taash has a lot of dialogue about dragons. They are very adamant that dragons are a certain way, even to a point of being somewhat actually about them. They've made this their identity and their profession, dragon hunting. Another point has appeared there though. Wonder what that could mean.
Taash, what are you doing?
She's not in her lair. I was ready. I could have fought her.
Taash!
Doesn't matter. I can still look for clues. See if she'll turn into a monster like Killiane's archdemon did. I have to figure this out. I'm a dragon slayer. I've got to be ready to fight her. I'm a dragon slayer.
Taash.
I'm a crappy Kunari. I'm not really Ravani. I'm no good as a daughter. I can't even be a woman right. I have to be a dragon slayer.
This could just be them and their gender identity feels, and the dragon is reminding them of all of the horrible things that they've gone through. But again, why did that counter go up, do we think? I think it's safe to assume that Taash has a special interest, or was written to have a special interest. For those that don't know, a special interest is defined as a subject that is all-consuming to an autistic person. They might collect things of their interest and only their interest. It will impede on their social life by making it hard for the autistic person to talk about literally anything else but their special interest. They don't understand when someone won't find their special interest exciting or don't want to engage with them about said interest. It is a lifelong thing and might lead them to take up a job that's related to their special interest, like Taash and dragon hunting. Taash loves dragons. Taash barely talks about anything but dragons. It is a cultural thing, yes, but every other Kunari we come across doesn't talk at great lengths about them. They do know other information, they engage in shorter conversations about their culture with Emmrich, and have the odd interaction with others that are off the topic completely, but it always comes back to the dragons. Always. Keep an eye on that counter while I play another scene for you.
Trophy from the Fang Scorcher?
She was a good fight. You kept your cool in the middle of a dragon fight.
People who can't keep their cool end up dead.
Or a meal.
Ouch. When you were standing over the dragon, you said something. Chakra Toebra. It's the same thing your mother told you. You struggle the way you are?
You must struggle with what you are. It's what she told me when I was a kid. Still does, so I don't let the dragon out.
Meaning your fire breath?
It's not just about the fire. It's about how stuff makes me feel. What I do when I'm angry.
I've seen you angry. You're fine.
No, I'm not. I can get this rage where I just have to break something, and I can get stuck in arguments, needing things to be a certain way. The Antam would have turned me into a berserker, breathing fire across the battlefield, killing anything in my way. I don't want to be that.
You saw it go up, didn't you? Taash exhibits some pretty classic symptoms here. Having a very strong sense of justice, being incredibly stubborn, and getting stuck in black and white thinking are pretty much the hallmark of someone having autism other than special interests, not reading social cues right, and stimming. There are other things, of course. There's things like overstimulation, which I myself unfortunately experienced quite a bit of, but just to get to my point, things are adding up for Taash being autistic coded. As an autistic person myself, I really related to this scene. Whenever I debate with my husband about silly things like fandom theories, I can feel myself take it incredibly seriously, despite it being nothing in the grand scheme of things. But it's not nothing to me, because it's about my special interest, it's part of my identity, and I know I'm right. Or at least, I think I'm right. We don't have a lot of evidence that Taash has meltdowns in an autistic fashion, but their admittance of having these rages is felt at least by myself as well. I get so angry and want to jump out of my own skin when I'm frustrated, and I cannot let it go ever. That is called autistic perseveration, and it's a doozy. I'll have arguments with myself, talking back and forth about something I saw online, and it will bother me for weeks. It will ruin my day. Even more evidence to me that Taash is autistic coded. I'm sure there are other arguments that can be made about them being other forms of neurodivergent, and this whole conversation and Tasha's conversations in general could all be chalked up to just not being understood as a non-binary person and being someone who has been routinely put down. But I do think there's something else there. In the end, they're just trying to relate to people the only way that they know how, and I think that's incredibly sweet. All this to say, if you don't like Taash because they talk strange, don't act according to the social rules, are cringe and incredibly blunt, or talk a lot about their interests in themselves, I'm not gonna want to sit with you at the internet lunch table. To me, it makes me wonder how you might treat other autistics out in the wild, and if you are autistic yourself, it makes me wonder what you think about other autistics in the community, and those who might not necessarily fit your vision of truly autistic. Taash isn't narcissistic. They're neurodivergent, or at least coded that way, as is everyone else in Veilguard. All of them probably have PTSD or CPTSD, severe anxiety, crippling depression, and ADHD in Ballara's case, among other things. Yet, I see people defend all of these other characters and their supposed mental health struggles, but never Taash. So, I don't know, maybe we need to unpack that as a fandom and community. But the Dragon Age fandom has always had a problem with ableism, so as has society in general, so I'm not entirely sure that's ever gonna happen. You might be wondering if I have any criticisms of Taash. I sing their praises and I seem to love every aspect of their story, right? Well, yeah, for the most part, but there is something that I agree on that every other person has brought up about Taash and criticisms about their identity. Their identity is written from a very milquetoast white perspective. Trick Weeks, as far as I know, is just a normal white LGBTQ+ person. That means that aside from all of the research that they might have put into writing Taash from a social and heritage perspective, they don't really have any lived experience to talk about that. So on the side of being non-binary, they do incredibly well. But on the side of Taash having to choose between being Qunari and Ravani, it's definitely a problem. Dragon Age has had a issue with Orientalism and racism for a very long time, as well as a dash of anti-Semitism. As a Jewish person myself, I was pretty happy that there wasn't any slur calling or blood libel thrown about in Veilguard, but when it came to Ballara feeling responsible for her gods and the things that they've done to people, and Taash having to choose between their cultural identities, I did not enjoy that. The Qunari are written from an Islamophobic and Orientalist perspective. There are multiple sources that state Swana cultures, and specifically Muslim and Islamic cultures, have inspired the Qunari, which would be a cool thing if they were written well, but the Qunari are shown to be this horde of brutes that apparently are just one step away from being animals if they don't follow their religious code to the T. Weird, if you ask me. The whole converting everyone to the Qun thing that seems to be pervasive throughout the series is also strange, considering the inspiration comes from Muslim culture. In fact, it is mostly white Christian Europeans that are always doing all the converting, and they did it in the Crusades and have done so since the Crusades. So, strange. As a whole, choosing between the Qunari and the Ravani culture for Taash is seen as a pretty easy choice. For most players, they wouldn't choose Qunari, especially if they're a returning fan. Why would they, if they have been shown at every turn that the Qunari are an imperialistic and brutal culture that tell their people who they are and won't hear otherwise? Regardless of how gentle they are in showing the ways of their culture, Taash isn't really given the choice of being who they want to be here, and it shouldn't be up to Rook anyway. Taash should get to choose who they are in every aspect. Being Qunari and Ravani is good. You can be those things at the same time. Plenty of people are multicultural. Coming to terms with your heritage can be quite healing, and I think preserving Qunari culture, much like their mother did, is probably a good thing for Taash to do, but I still think it should have been some sort of different choice set that they put into their final quest scene rather than this. And it's pretty ignorant of the writers and Trick Weeks to assume you would have to choose between your cultural identities anyway. But what can you do when pretty much every other marginalized race in this game is told that they have to be one way or another and not anything else? Anyway, Taash is non-binary, Taash is cringe, and Taash is clunky. But they're my clunky, cringe, non-binary Blorbo, and I will defend them for as long as I am around. They're not written poorly, at least not entirely. They were written with love and honor, if a bit of ignorance, just like any of your favorite Dragon Age characters. It's a feature at this point. If we're criticizing Taash, let's put the non-binary thing to a side and maybe talk about the racism thing a bit more. Yeah, Thanks for getting through this. I appreciate you listening to me ramble. There should be a full-length review of Veilguard coming out here pretty soon. Be warned, it does spoil most, if not all, of the game, and I'll also have some more lore-focused content as well. I also have been asked to do a what your favorite non-romanceable NPC says about you. So if you have a favorite non-romanceable NPC from the Dragon Age games, go ahead and put it in the comments down below, and maybe I'll add them to the list and roast you. If you enjoyed my content, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. And also, if you want to follow me or become a patron, all of my socials are in the description down below. I hope you have a nice rest of your night or your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.